Welcome out to Belief for America. I am Austin Hepworth. I'm a law guy, an attorney by trade, and also here with Michael Hepworth, who's a number guy, a data miner, IT guy by trade. And we are here to talk about America and what we feel is necessary for liberty and freedom to prevail. We believe very strongly that America is the amazing country it is because of the foundation it's built upon. We believe that America was built on a very solid balance of morality and law, and that this is reflected in the song that says, where it says, "For America, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty and law." And that to us really explains what America is about, is striking this balance. And so we go from anarchy, where there's no law on the scale, to tyranny, where law dictates everything. And we believe that somewhere in the middle, there's a balance where there is law necessary to pull us out of anarchy, but too much law throws things off, which means that we have to have individual morality. So we're going to talk some today about the Fourth Amendment and searches and seizures. It's common for people to refer to the Fourth Amendment as there being a right to privacy, and it's not exactly framed that way in the Constitution. It's framed slightly differently. But certainly privacy has been used in the discussions about the Fourth Amendment. And our goal today with it is to give you an understanding a little bit of how courts have looked at the situation, as well as current challenges with privacy, where society is trying to figure out how to strike this balance of what is appropriate, what isn't. Because there's a lot going on. There's a lot at stake for some people, at least with what some people believe. And certainly there is a lot of power involved with whether it's private companies, government, other things when it comes to data. There's a lot of power in data. And so these are topics that come up in America frequently. But to start out, we'll go back in history a little bit to the case of Terry versus Ohio. And this case is what gave America kind of a label for a certain type of police action. They call it Terry stop. But in that case, there was a man on the street. Police stopped to talk to him, and the police, kind of following the police hunch, said, let's pat this guy down. We think he might have a weapon. And so they pat him down to make sure they're safe. And in the process of patting him down, they discover some drugs or something in his pocket and arrest him for that. So he makes the argument that he was searched without probable cause or without it. And so if we go to the Fourth Amendment and read the actual text of it, it says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So the Fourth Amendment is interesting. There's two parts. It says that the people are supposed to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. And then it says that no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. And so the Constitution didn't expressly say what was a reasonable search or seizure or what was an unreasonable one. And it didn't say expressly what was required. It was kind of short. And so in looking at this, the courts have had to decide, well, unreasonable search and seizure, what is that? I think in general, the courts looked at it as you need probable cause if you're going to have a search or seizure. And in general, you need a warrant. But you have to remember the Fourth Amendment did not expressly say that all searches and seizures had to have a warrant. It doesn't say that. It just says the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. But that infers there's a reasonable search and seizure. And then it says, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. And so the police can certainly get a warrant to search or seize things, to arrest somebody. But as the courts have looked at this, there are things they allow without a warrant when they consider it to be a reasonable use of police force. And then there are searches and seizures that, again, in general, the courts have said, yeah, you need probable cause to do that. But the case in Terry came up, Terry versus Ohio, because Terry said, well, the police didn't have probable cause here. They didn't have a reason to believe I had a gun. They didn't have a reason to believe I had drugs. It was just their gut feeling. That's not probable cause. And in general, gut feelings are not probable cause for the police. They have to have something more than that, something tangible to create probable cause. And they didn't have it. So the Supreme Court, in looking at this, says, well, what are we going to allow? Are we going to do anything about this or are we not? And they upheld this conviction for the drug evidence or the illegal contraband that he had. And they said, if the police have a reasonable suspicion that there's danger, then it's okay for them to pat someone down to see if there's a gun. Because we're not going to ask the police to go out and get injured, and they're doing their job. And so this case highlights a couple of things. One is there is a lower standard in police work that applies sometimes, which is just reasonable suspicion. And that really tends to follow a policeman's or policewoman's internal gut feelings or training where they said, yeah, in the last 30 situations I've seen where someone did this, they had a gun with them or whatnot. But it doesn't rise to the level of probable cause as stated in the Fourth Amendment. But in evaluating why the court would do this, it brings us to this place of understanding a little bit about the Constitution. The Constitution states it's the supreme law of the land. And amazingly, that is probably the constitutional provision that is often not followed in constitutional interpretation. Because when a judge gets a constitutional case, they are always asking the question of, does the government have a compelling reason to override the Constitution in this scenario? So if you look at a freedom of religion case, for example, and with the draft, people can say, hey, it's against my religion to kill people. I can't fight in war. And the government says, or the court says, there's a pretty strong, compelling reason to require you to go to war. Because if you don't, our country may fall apart, may get taken over. And they look at the morality of sometimes requiring wars or a draft versus the constitutional right in place with the freedom of religion. And they ask the same question, though, in all contexts. They'll say, does this violate the Constitution? And sometimes the answer is yes. And then they'll say, okay, if it does violate the Constitution, is there a compelling interest or a substantial interest for the government in doing so? When they ask that question, they are literally asking, what's the highest level of morality to pursue in this scenario? And to me, what it reflects is a court understanding that America is this balance of confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty and law. To me, the phrase confirm thy soul in self-control means morality. And the courts are saying, is there a higher morality that we need to balance even some of the Constitution with? And they've been asking that question now for hundreds of years and looking at things to say, yep, it violates the Constitution, what the government's doing, but is there a compelling reason? Or is there a substantial reason to do so? And that is something that gives courts the ability to start to have other morality govern. And the reason that this is important to understand is that as a society, as we adopt new forms of morality, we have to understand that each one of those forms of morality we adopt will eventually make its way into a constitutional case. Because if as a society we feel there's a higher level of morality, then we are at a place where we've now put in a new basis to override the Constitution. As an example of one of those levels of morality that comes in, that this Terry case shows us, they were concerned about the safety of police officers. In general, I think most people would say, yeah, the cops need to make sure they're safe. But when you start to expound that out expand it into, well, is there a right to safety? And you look at what society grew into with the right to safety in COVID, essentially there was a very large number of constitutional violations during that time, government exercising a lot of power, doing a lot of things in the name of safety. And if we put safety first as one of our highest and guiding principles, a do no harm, that no child should ever be bullied, a thing that no person should ever experience any type of danger or harm, we're starting to really live by this do no harm or safety first type mentality. As we do that, we will see court cases find in constitutional challenges to government action that the government was justified because there was a safety concern. And so as a society, we as a people, any moral place that we need to keep and maintain, we have to speak up on that. We have to push back against things that push for new rights and push for new sayings. And this isn't to say that an employee's safety isn't important, that employers shouldn't use safety procedures, but it's to say, understand the deeper principle that if we say safety first, then we're going to allow more and more overrides of these freedoms. And for every new moral code or morality we adopt, it'll change how the Constitution's interpreted over time. That will inevitably happen because the courts will look to those justifications to say, is it a compelling interest for the government? Is there a good reason to violate the Constitution in this scenario? And the courts have always been pragmatic in that sense. They will not just enforce the pure text of the Constitution if it's going to have some crazy, absurd result. And it's one of the reasons that we've ended up in an interesting spot with criminal law in America. The Fourth Amendment currently mostly protects people from going to jail if the government violates the Fourth Amendment. But there are other issues, and we'll get into those in a little bit with technology and other things that we have to look at of saying what is taking place, where is the balance currently, and should we adjust things? But in the Terry case, these things expand. That reasonable suspicion expanded, for example, into the school context, where school officers, principal, police officers there, whatever, pat down a student or search a student's bag or do different things. And even though there's not probable cause, even though they don't have a verifiable reason, a lot of those searches get upheld because of reasonable suspicion. And they said, well, they have suspicion about it. We can trust these officers. They know what they're talking about. And that is a piece where students don't have as much expectation of privacy in the schoolhouse. They can be searched. The government can look through their bags, can look through different things with more just a suspicion. And again, people may say, well, that's good. It keeps my kids safer. But again, and going back to, well, if we adopt the right to safety and it governs everything, we will feel a loss of freedoms in many areas because the government has to ensure our safety now, if we view that as a morality or a right. And so that is one aspect of this whole side of things. The other aspect, though, is what is a court to do if the police violate the Fourth Amendment? So let's just say the police just storm into your house, no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, no warrant. They find you doing something illegal, they arrest you, and take you down to the police station. Judges for a long time have struggled with, well, what do we do in that scenario? And the Constitution doesn't say, it just says you have this right. It's not supposed to be violated, but it was violated. So what do we do? And so the courts came up with something they called the exclusionary rule, where they said, we're going to kick evidence out that's obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Basically saying, we don't really know how else to enforce this. What are we supposed to do if it's violated? Do you just get 1 year less in jail? Do you get the evidence kicked out? What goes on? And it's been a difficult question. There have been some scholars in the last number of years that have proposed alternatives. to say we don't have to have the exclusionary rule. There's other options. But currently, if there is a search or seizure, where the police come and look at something or the government's looking at something, the courts will look at and say, did this violate the Constitution? Which means, was it an unreasonable search and seizure, or was there a warrant obtained? And if it violated the Constitution, does it have to be excluded? And even though they have the exclusionary rule and they kick out a lot of the evidence, they have exceptions to the exclusionary rule they've come up with. For example, one's called if you will just discover it anyways. And so if the police were going to find it, no matter what, and they just got to it early because of an illegal thing, but maybe someone was getting a warrant at the same time and they would have been there and found it, then does it have to be excluded? No, they'd say it was going to be discovered anyways. And there's quite a few of these different scenarios and situations that they've carved out exceptions to the exclusionary rule because they don't love it. Judges don't love having someone that's been doing something illegal get off because the police didn't quite do things correctly in gathering the evidence. And so the Fourth Amendment is, again, it's meant to try and be a balance of saying the government can't just come take whatever from you. There has to be some level of security. I think they call it the right to be secure. And that it's not supposed to be violated. But what do we do about it when it is violated? And so again, the exclusionary rules are currently, some people have proposed being able to sue the police and get paid money damages. So you'd have a criminal in jail suing, getting money damages, and they get paid money while they're in jail. I don't know, unique scenario, but that is one where America has to look at it and say, well, what do we do? If we want to put this check on the government, what do we do? And so that's kind of a basic lay of the land as it relates to the law. Again, the law in this area is very nuanced. Tons of changes, tons of cases, tons of precedent that they go through, but there is a lot there. And so that is a quick example there, but we also have the side to look at is IT and where we're at there.
And real quick, before I get into that, just to piggyback off of what you're talking about, sometimes when we say, what are we going to do about these issues? We need to accept that there may not be the greatest solution out there. We need to kind of accept trade-offs. So when, the exclusionary principle was carved out, I think some people were probably thinking, well, how do we create an incentive to not just bust in with poor searches and seizures all the time? If the police could just do it without any repercussions, then they just do it all the time. And would we always be in fear of the police coming into your home, breaking in whenever they wanted? Somebody probably thought, well, maybe there should be repercussion. Maybe if we don't do it correctly, then we can't take people that are doing things wrong and put them into jail. And so we should be careful so that citizens that aren't doing anything incorrectly don't have to fear. They have that security, right? I'm not saying this is the right solution. I'm pointing out that there are trade-offs. If we're going to make this work, we can't just get the maximum privacy and also enjoy the maximum safety and also enjoy the maximum religious freedom. There's a balance between everything. Humans are imperfect and there will always be bad actors. And so we have to kind of find a balance. We have to take on some responsibility as citizens, say we're going to step up, to your point, and try to live more moral, ethic lives and not ask such a large burden of the government so that they're not always tied trying to figure out every way to save us from ourselves. And then we can also try to get together and talk about what we expect the government to bring to the table. But it's a trade-off. It's a back and forth.
Yeah, and I think it is very helpful to point out that so far no one is even remotely close to loving any of the solutions to enforce the Fourth Amendment. And there are significant trade-offs with each one. And so people could debate back and forth, is it good, is it bad, where is it? But it comes down to a practical question of, well, what's the higher principle? What are we trying to achieve? And should there be some check on the government? is there something we feel is important enough that we're going to justify letting a criminal go? And does that create an incentive for the police? And that is one of the things that the courts felt is pretty painful for a policeman to arrest someone and then get them, watch them go because they made a mistake. And so there is this incentive to help the police kind of self-regulate in that. But it's not perfect. And it is a balance. And that's part of what we're trying to strike is not perfect. What do we do? How do we make these things happen? Because yes, we have a constitution, which is incredible. It's given us a foundation and a piece of things, but we're still working to figure out what that means and where that goes for us.
Absolutely. And I think the discussion that you mentioned about safety has been a large factor in a lot of these issues. A great example is the terrorist attacks on 9/11 and the Patriot Act. People are looking to find safety and security, and as a result, some of the privacy that we enjoyed before kind of took a hit. So that can be discussed in more detail. But so one side of it is kind of a look towards getting more safety for individuals. The other side, as you mentioned, is technology and what technology is kind of doing to privacy. So let me just kind of go through maybe the technological landscape of today, how it's changed and how that has affected privacy concerns. Just kind of as a quick note, Pew did some research. They did some polling of Americans. They just kind of want to get a feel of what Americans thought about their ability to have privacy. This isn't stating that the opinions in the poll are accurate. This is just what people thought. And when they asked Americans if they thought they could go through daily life without having their data collected, about 62% didn't believe it was possible for either company to go through life without data being collected by either companies or the government. So some 38% thought maybe it's possible. Most Americans, 81%, thought that they had no control or very little control over the data that companies collect from them. That's a huge majority. 81% of Americans thought that they have no or little control of that data either collected by companies or the government. So this is a huge issue for Americans. Most people feel that they have no control or very little control of data that companies may be collecting about them, which is part of the reason why I think it's debated so, I guess, forcefully. But some of the technology that kind of makes this work, if we think of the ability today to hold information by computers, today we have supercomputers, not your computer in your house, but supercomputers that can store and process exabytes of data. Now, just for scale, an exabyte is 1,000,000 trillion bytes. That's quite huge. Another way to look at it is if you were to take the old CD-ROMs from back in the day, 15 years ago, and take like a 720 megabyte one of those and stack them, the stack would reach almost to the moon before it could hold an exabyte of data. But today we can store that and process it in supercomputers. So the ability for large companies to pay for and manage very, very, very large amounts of data is here. And that's kind of what's fueled this. Question is, where does that data come from? Probably most of the sources. The internet in general has all kinds of data gathering techniques, one of them being what we call cookies, small pieces of data the websites store on your computer. It usually enables personalization so that as you move from site to site, maybe ads can be populated based on something you've looked at somewhere else. They can store user information about yourself, such as usernames and such things. Generally, these kinds of pieces of technology, and you'll see as we go through these, are put in for the sake of convenience initially, or for efficiency. And the privacy side of it is usually coming in secondhand after there's been a lot of concerns. So you get on the internet, cookies start collecting data of what you click on, where you go. You your internet service provider has all the data of what you click on, where you go. They can store that off if they need to. And so just getting on the internet and clicking around, all those things are logged away somewhere and they can be accessed if need to be. A great example of this is as I prepare for some of these podcasts we do, I start doing research on a particular subject, and for example, the Second Amendment, and every website I went to after I was researching for about a week was just giving me ads for guns, or if you got on YouTube, there's all these videos about guns, and just all the different websites were talking to each other about my browsing history. And it happens for everything we looked at. I've been looking at privacy and technology, and I'm getting ads and I'm getting articles popping up for all that stuff. So all this data is stored and it's processed and it's used to give you kind of more information when you're online. That was the intent. We know social media is always gathering information about you. There's a lot of information you give voluntarily. You usually agree to a service agreement when you use social media, and then you put certain information about yourself on there. And so the company has it, and if it's used, it could probably infer a lot of things about you. Sometimes you're tempted to exchange personal data for benefits of using the service. You can get more benefits if you add more personal data. You can see more information about friends of friends if you connect into certain groups. So there's a lot of data given willingly. There's a lot of data collected just by the social media site, in that they can see what ads you're clicking on. They can even tell many times when you're like scrolling through a list of feeds, which ones you maybe sit and read longer than others. And so those kinds of feeds will start to populate more often. So they have all that kind of information. There's also, I guess what we'll just call big data outside of social media and the internet. Think of these as transactions. For example, using your credit card. Credit card information is stored. There's a lot of laws around storing credit card information and how it's supposed to be handled, but it's definitely a security privacy concern if any of that stuff gets hacked into. There is, anytime you make a transaction at a store, that transaction's logged. If you buy fuel somewhere, that transaction's logged. All this data gets stored somewhere, and it can be sold and traded. And maybe it doesn't connect specifically to you, or maybe it does, if they can connect your credit card with the transaction. And so the ability to process massive amounts of data is necessary for getting through all this data that's being collected. And we have that ability today. Mobile devices are a huge source of data. Obviously, with the smartphones we have today, again, people are kind of tempted into giving a lot of their information out. You can use more of the smart features on your smartphone if you turn on your location, if you feed it data about what you like and where you want to go to eat, and things you search for on your mobile device. It will use that in future searches to help prompt you and give you certain information. And all of that data, again, is being stored somewhere, and it can be accessed. All the phones have GPS sensors on them, and so can you work in reverse and find out your location instead of you using your location to find somewhere? Could somebody use your location to find you? And again, we give that out many times. We turn it on and we say, let all my friends know where I am right now. And then what if one of your friends is, compromised their phone or something like that? And so we give out a lot of this information quite willingly. And then one of the last areas, there's a couple more, but one last area we'll talk about is what's called the Internet of Things. These are all your smart devices that are getting really popular in homes today. These are your ovens that will talk to Alexa. You can tell Alexa to turn your oven on and heat it up to a certain temperature. All that data is logged away. Every transaction you have with Alexa. These are your doorbell cameras. These are your locks on your door. I know of a company that collects the data from locks and analyzes how the pattern of usage. How often is a code put in versus how often is it manually locked? What is the sequence of patterns Is it manually open? Is it code put in and then manually locked? It looks at battery usage. It can look at all these different things. So all these smart devices are logging data and it's being stored somewhere by somebody. And so technology today really plays a huge part in the debate over privacy. How much we give up for mostly convenience, many times for safety, and then how much access does a company and then the government have to that data is one of the big concerns we have for sure.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because we're kind of in this funny zone with the Fourth Amendment, because the Fourth Amendment applies to the government's actions, and technology is mostly, at least it has been, mostly companies and private groups. But we are reaching a point where things like the NSA having huge databases and collecting all kinds of info on Americans, is that an unreasonable search and seizure? There's not probable cause to believe that every American's a criminal, I guess, unless they're trying to claim they all violated some tax code of the crazy number of pages of tax codes that exist or something. But it becomes this interesting question, because one of the problems, and the Patriot Act really highlighted this. So following 9/11, the Patriot Act comes out, and the government didn't directly say that it would step into collecting info, but it did authorize the government to subpoena companies and get their information. And so now there's kind of this middleman where I could have a bunch of info. I don't even know if Google or Facebook or others subpoenaed for my info. I have no idea. The government just has all that data that these companies have collected on me now. And is that violating the Fourth Amendment or the spirit of the Fourth Amendment to say to the government, oh, well, just because someone else collected data on somebody, sure, go take it from them. I don't know if that's an issue that the founders fully could have anticipated back then. Technology, if you think about 1700s, if you had something, you kept it to yourself, right? There wasn't, I can't think of a scenario where they would have envisioned this middleman having all your information and the government going to the middleman and saying, hey, it's not you, don't worry, we're not after you, Facebook, we're not after you, Google, but we're really interested in this guy, so give us your data on him. And by the way, it's a subpoena, it's authorized by law. You'll go to jail if you don't give it to us. Now, I'd be very interested to know what the founders would have thought of that type of scenario. I really don't think they could have envisioned it, though. And privacy, again, the amendment doesn't mention privacy directly, but privacy to me is an area where we are ripe for potential abuse, and I don't feel there actually is a lot of, or are a lot of checks and balances in place, where this is an area that maybe as Americans we need to have ongoing discussions to say, what is okay for the government to do in these scenarios? Is it okay for the NSA to collect all this data? They have huge data centers now, and they have one here in Utah. It's, I don't know, 25 minutes away from my house. It's huge, but it goes underground very far. It sucks an incredible amount of water here in the desert to keep it cool. And they're processing insane amounts of information there. And what is all the info? They don't exactly tell us. Does it include something about Americans? Most likely. It's pretty clear that they're collecting something. And then again, well, what is that? Should the government not be able to look at it if I put it online? If I put something on YouTube and the government search that now, and that's something to know about America is in public, the police can observe things, they can look at things. They can certainly, it's pretty interesting to see how many shooting scenarios or attack scenarios actually people post on Facebook or some kind of social media beforehand. Someone picks it up or the police pick it up, they flag it, they're able to stop the person. They've had a fair number of them stopped by simply watching social media, because for whatever reason it is, once people get to that place, struggle not talking. And there was, I believe there was a company, I think their name was called Banjo, that came out. They were combing public databases and public information. So if you were sharing your location publicly, or on social media, logged in and doing something live streaming or whatever, they had technology watching all these things, every public source of info possible, and they could detect, oftentimes, not every single time, but they could often detect as soon as a crime started occurring, just from combing public data. And I believe Utah moved to partnership with them and work with them, again, because it's a private company doing it. And then they're assisting the government. That's one of the ways the government's kind of skirting some of the constitutional stuff right now. But Banjo, it came out in the news that one of its founders was racist or something like that. And so there's been a disconnect. I don't know their status currently. I'm sure if they were to do anything, they'd be rebranding and trying to come out under a new name and something. But they developed this database of public information, and they could detect very quickly if a crime was happening. If there were gunshots fired, they'd pick it up on someone's live stream. And the AI would automatically go, "Ooh, we heard a gun in a live stream." They would then go dial in to say, where's the location, what's going on, use other publicly available info, and quickly, very quickly, within seconds often, dial down to say a shooting just occurred here. And it's pretty amazing to look at. And some people have said, well, this is appalling. We should never let the government have this kind of power. And then you look at it on the flip side and go, but if it's all publicly available data, what is the balance? How do you say to the government, don't take that data, don't use that? And and I've created a few scenarios for people to talk through when they review the law. And one of them, I talk about a guy, and it mixes a bunch of constitutional principles together. It's a fake scenario, but we say his church is called WART. We reveal all truth. And in the scenario I put in, this guy goes around and it says he places listening devices in people's homes, and then he publishes information that he learns about the people. And the people in the town are getting really upset by it. And so we say, what's the remedy? And what can people do? What should they be able to do? And most people are pretty appalled by the guy. And they all say, well, he should be convicted of placing things in people's homes to listen. And I say, well, why? They say, because that's illegal. You can't do that. I say, but it doesn't say he forced his way in there. It just says he put it there. But what if the people actually asked for it to be put there? What are we doing with Alexas? What are we doing with our computers, with our smartphones? They're listening devices. We know it. We're consenting to it. And then as we talk about this right to privacy, though, this is where I struggle with the right to privacy versus the moral obligation. Because if I put an Alexa in my home, do I have a right to privacy at that point? Maybe as it relates to the government, but talking about morally, Amazon, Google, whoever, can I insist that they don't keep certain things, they don't do certain things and mandate that by law? Or should it be allowed to be a choice for people, where people truly opt in and choose what they want and what they don't want? Because someone could say, I want them to listen to everything. I want them to know if there's someone that breaks in this house and I start screaming help, they need to be there immediately. I'm not doing anything illegal, but there could be someone crazy come in, or I'm an old person, I may need help at times. I want them to listen to everything. And people may have a reason for that on the convenience scale, on whatever it is they want to do. People could opt into publicly sharing all info to try and reduce crime. And this right to privacy, I think one of the reasons we've struggled so much with it as a society is because if we come out with just a strong right to privacy, it shuts down a lot of what's potentially available for people, what they can choose to opt into, what they can choose for efficiency or convenience or other things in their life. And technology is really putting us at this crazy place of so much data, so much power, so much convenience. How do we balance it? Because I'm choosing it to some degree. Now, do I choose everything? You know, could there be limits maybe of something like if you have a webcam on your computer, can the terms of use from your computer manufacturer say they can turn it on whenever they want? Maybe they should be restricted from that unless you expressly opt in. But again, someone could say, yeah, please check in on me. They could have a service that says we can turn on your webcam whenever because we're checking to make sure you're okay if you're an older person. People could have a use for that. So it becomes very difficult to legislate to say you absolutely can't do something because if it's true consent and someone really needs it or wants it, yeah, how do we manage that? How do we look at those things?
Which I definitely think is the struggle today, because there's kind of two sides to it. There's what kind of transactions do we enter into with a private company that provides an Alexa to your home? And then what should be allowable in that case? And then what can the government have access to at that point? If we've told a company they can have our information, do we then say, and the government can have it too if they subpoena it with, probable cause? And it's becoming an issue because as privacy and security concerns grow, technology around protecting your information is growing. And so, cryptography and things like that are exploding as they're trying to figure out ways to keep your data safe. As some companies make their phones harder to hack or their databases harder to hack, they're getting requests from government now to provide a backdoor so that if a government seizes the phone, they can get into the phone, they can unlock it essentially, or other types of data. And so as we work to combat some of these issues, the government's asking for permission to backdoor some of the work we're doing so that they can continue to have access. And we say to ourselves, do we want that? Is it important that when somebody's arrested and they have a lot of important information on their phone that the government can get to it? Or do we say, nope, you're out of luck, you can't use this device, you're just not going to be able to get all that information? It becomes a really it's a really tough question. How do we handle it with private companies? How do we handle it with the government? And to your point, we have to start with ourselves and say, what are we willing to do personally? Are we just going to give up all privacy for the sake of convenience? Do we have a line we want to draw somewhere? Sometimes it takes us standing up and maybe doing something less convenient or not as fun as far as technology goes, but we kind of have to look at ourselves first and decide how we project that onto the community and then the government around us.
Yeah. And it is this massive struggle. And again, people articulate and say we should have a right to privacy. And in some ways, again, I agree. I don't think the government should come snooping in our home. Another one that came up was in New York over Labor Day. They have a ban about the number of people that can gather on properties, and they were going to fly drones over properties to see. Technically, that's public space if you're outdoors. But something about that feels very wrong to me, to have the government using drones and technology. I know society's had an extreme rub with traffic cameras, speeding cameras, things like that just pick up things. Because we recognize how difficult life can become if every time you go a mile over the speed limit, there's a traffic camera that flashes. Or I was in Naples, Florida when they installed a bunch of traffic cameras. And if you just cross the line just barely at the stop where they have the white line you're supposed to stop at, snap a picture. And then red light runners, if a light turned yellow, it was interesting to watch what a camera at every intersection was doing, because then people would slam on their brakes as soon as the light went yellow, trying to not get caught when they should have gone through to be safe, but it snaps a picture. And they didn't ticket every single person, but you didn't know. You would see it flash. You'd always know it flashed at you. And it produced this kind of paranoia about, oh, I've got to live perfectly. I've got to do everything perfectly. or else this traffic intersection just cost me another $300 or whatever the ticket price is. And it was really interesting to feel that and feel it doesn't feel like America. It feels wrong. It feels out of place. And it has been interesting to watch the extreme pushback against that. But then again, drones are coming in. So you have a government drone hovering, watching. You know, I can imagine the drones are going to get good enough to start to do facial recognition, to start to do different things. And what do we do? Do we just take it, or do we actually insist on a check and balance in place with these things?
And imagine instead of drones, though, that the government just subpoenaed Alexa and Google use records, and they use voice identification to figure out how many people were in your home. That's you've given out that information voluntarily, right? And then the government subpoenaed it, and then they're like, hey, you had too many people in your house. We can tell by the number of voices. So it gets pretty deep. If the government stops flying drones, but then just gets your Alexa data that you voluntarily gave to Amazon, that's kind of an interesting scenario.
Yeah, that's a great point to think about that of, could the government just listen to your Alexa records and say, Alexa, how many people are there? How many voices do you pick up? And that is, again, in the fight against, the quote, fight against COVID, Utah had a time when they said no more than 10 people in a home. And I have 8 children. We had 10 people. And what do we do? What does that look like? And it goes back to this place of, yep, there has to be some morality, but this may be an area where to have true liberty, we may need some laws and some protections in place. That's my honest feeling, is that there may need to be some type of regulation, some balance struck somewhere in all this to say what types of efficiency and convenience will allow, maybe what it takes to override that and allow people to truly opt in. Maybe it's got to be a true opt-in scenario where it can't just be terms of use that apply to everything. Again, I don't know entirely the answer on this one. I just know that a blanket right to privacy isn't going to work because Americans demand too much convenience. And technology provides a lot of convenience that, in theory, we shouldn't need a full blanket right to privacy because it's one of the things that also allows things to be free. If you demand all privacy, you'll pay for everything. And so America's not at a place where they want that either. And I think a company should be allowed to say, hey, we'll sell your data. If you're that cheap, you don't want to pay for it, and you don't value your privacy, sure, we'll offer that in exchange. That is an option. And there are options that people can pay for that have a lot bigger respective data and privacy. And there are obviously other options being built that people are working on. But this is a piece where we as people have to say, what is the balance here? And especially going back to the government, the private public partnerships, I still really struggle with the government utilizing private companies to circumvent the Constitution. And to say, well, it's not us. Well, you consented. Because even in the Fourth Amendment things, one of the things the courts have been very strong on is that the police can ask you if they can search your stuff, and they don't have to tell you. You can say no. So with Miranda rights, for whatever reason, they felt it important enough to say you have the right to remain silent once you're arrested. But if the police just walk up to me and say, hey, Austin, can I search your car? And I say no, many Americans are afraid to tell the police no. But they don't have to tell me you have the right to say no. They can just say, can I search? And so this came up even in a case where a man was on a bus. He's there with his luggage, traveling. 2 police officers get on at a stop, start going through everyone, say, hey, can I see your ID? We're just checking. Can I? If a policeman walks up to you and says, can I see your ID? I think most people would view that as a command to give them your ID and have that checked. And if you say no, what instantly happens is the police say, oh, this guy's suspicious. Let's pat him down. Let's go through these things. And so in this bus stop case, the man's there, the police are asking for things, he gives them his ID. They look at it, nothing suspicious. And then they say, oh, well, can we search your bag too? Guy's sitting there on a bus, 2 police officers standing there surrounded by everyone. And so he says, yes. And they search and find drugs. And he gets arrested and put in jail. So he argues this isn't constitutional. This isn't, they're here abusing their power, essentially searching. The Supreme Court said, you consented. And they argued, his attorneys argued, that he was essentially contained in a bus. He couldn't back away, he couldn't move out, he's kind of cornered. The bus kind of creates walls to it. And the police, or the Supreme Court again, said no, it's consent. And they've gone this extensively to where they say, yeah, you consented, so it's okay. And it's interesting to go back to the text of the Fourth Amendment, because it just says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. It doesn't talk about consent, doesn't talk about any of those things. It just says shall not be violated. And again, the Supreme Court looks at it, they say, oh, there's a higher principle here, this principle of consent. You consented to waive your constitutional right. Now, again, is it possible in some scenarios to waive certain constitutional rights? I think so. So, for example, the right to a speedy trial. That's a common one that people will waive. They'll say, yep, I have a right to a speedy trial. The judges will say, are you going to force that right to a speedy trial? Or do you want to give your team more time to prepare? And you say, I'll waive my right to a speedy trial. I'll take more time to prepare. I think that's a proper use of consent. But think about a scenario where the government says, hey, we need you to get a sales tax license or a business license. We're going to mandate that. And you just, if you want this business license, you don't have to have a business license, but if you want it, you have to agree to waive your freedom of speech. Or if you want a driver's license, you have to agree to waive your freedom of speech. Now, this isn't real. They haven't done this, but I do see this type of thing brewing. When I look at business license applications, they have a contract and they say, you agree to do these certain things. And I go, you've just added conditions and you're now making it so I'm, quote, consenting by saying I want the business license, but you made the requirement in the first place that I have the business license. And now you're putting additional consent items in it that you're getting more from me than you were allowed under the law originally. And to me, it's a pretty extreme abuse of power. And it's one I'm seeing more and more that the government does. They say, oh, Austin, you want to sign up? Well, so the IRS, for example, they had child tax payments that they mandated that they'd send to every single person under COVID. And if you wanted to opt out because of your tax situation or in moral standing or any other reason, you had to. The only way to opt out was to consent to signing up for, I think, ID.me, where the government even took, I think, retina scans of your eyes through your webcam, all kinds of stuff. It was a crazy invasive procedure, but the only way to opt out of those was to submit to that procedure. But it was consensual because you didn't have to opt out, even though you could get penalized later if you received the funds and for whatever reason your tax scenario didn't jive with your tax scenario, you could still get penalized later. And I look at these situations and just go, this consent thing's going a little too far. We shouldn't be able to consent to all of these losses of freedoms that they're starting to put on us. The government should have to provide reasonable means. If you need a business license, you shouldn't have to consent to additional things in the application. If you need opt out of the IRS sending you money that's not yours, you shouldn't have to sign up for ID.me. There's so many things going on that to me are concerning in this realm. And again, I don't think that a blanket ban or a blanket right to privacy fixes or solves the problem. I think it's much more nuanced and much more balanced, where we have to become fairly articulate. And maybe there still is a consent option, but maybe the police have to tell you, can I search your bag? But just so you know, you have the right to tell me no, because I don't have probable cause right now. Maybe in that scenario, it's okay. When it's truly the police go, I can't do anything to you if you say no. Okay, no, not interested. and then they have to just walk away and not arrest you. But right now they can say, this guy looks suspicious. Let's keep questioning him. Let's do a Terry stop. Let's pat him down. They can start doing all different kinds of things. And people effectively don't truly have the right to consent when they don't know and when it's not communicated. And so that's one I would certainly push for, is on the police government consent side. Maybe even if the government's subpoenaing Google, Google has to send me a notice and say, hey, Austin, do you consent to the government taking your records? No, don't touch them unless they have a warrant. They need real probable cause. And that'd be an interesting balance to start to put in place, of still allowing technology and things to happen, but increasing an actual opt-in that's knowing and informed. And so that would be one I would at least very much support. I'd be interested here in the comments if any of you have concerns about something like that, because it's not one I've fully vetted, and I'd be interested to know the flip side of maybe some of the harm or issues associated with a true opt-in, where it's I have to actually choose to opt in at that moment to let the government have something, or they have to communicate, you have the right to say no to this. There's other options for you. And so that's at least one balance we may be able to put in place. But again, just saying a blanket right to privacy, it's way too complex in our world of convenience, efficiency, things that people choose, to just say it that way. And so this is an area that is very fascinating, very interesting. It is one where we need some people to really sit down and say, what are some ideas? Let's propose them. Let's start talking about them, and let's start putting some checks and balances in place. That's what the Constitution is all about. And there's the whole flip side of, do private companies need checks and balances? Can the private company just take my info and then later just say, we chose to give it to the government? Who cares? Again, similar to what happened with COVID with location data and all that. Or can they just say, we just chose to publish it on the web? Or, yep, we're sharing some of your famous emails that went through here because you sent all the emails through, you agreed we'd access to them. So we just picked our top 10 funniest emails and put them up here. At what point should an American be able to say, phone company, I'm paying you money, but you just don't have the option to take all the recordings and just do whatever you want with them. You need to just let stuff flow through. Or car companies, I look at it with car companies, they're starting to become subscription-based automobiles on it almost. And so what happens if the car company just says, yeah, it costs you $30,000 for this car, and in addition, you got to pay us $100 a month or else we'll turn it off. Or we listen to and watch everything. The cars have mandated, I think by 2026, they have to have a technology in them to sense if you are drowsy or impaired driver. And I think most companies are choosing to watch your eyes. But now all our cars are just going to have stuff that watch us. And you start to look at it and say, well, the law just mandated that. Companies are going to get all that info. When the law mandates something, should there also be a check and balance on what that company can do with it now? Here in Utah, they've mandated that by 2024, that the social media companies ID every single person that creates an account. You have to send them a birth certificate or driver's license or something to be able to get on the site. And I think my personal opinion is the social media companies love that, because they can say, hey, it's not our choice, the government said it, but it gives them a ton of power over me. And again, I can choose not to use some of the services. Facebook, expendable, but things like Google, can I truly opt out of no Google searches, no YouTube videos, no Gmail accounts? Maybe, for Google, but if every email provider has to ID me because I live in Utah, am I truly able to opt out of email? I can't function in today's world for the most part without an email account. And so when the law starts to mandate these pieces, I think these companies love it. They get a ton of power from it. And I think we're going to see more and more of these kind of public-private partnerships where the private companies will go tell the government, require we collect this data. We'd love it from everyone. And then they get it. But then what's the check and balance? And how do we go through this? And then again, the government has it. All these people have it. No more fake accounts. We can now track it back to everybody, which means if you start saying something that whatever site doesn't approve of, they can just cancel you forever, because you can't just sign up with a new birth date and a fake birth date or name and get back on. You're now just done. You're shut out of email because you violated their culture, their different things, or you said something they didn't like. So I guess I'm saying that as it relates to privacy and private companies, I actually think in the balance, there has to be some type of protection against private companies in order for there to be a true balance. Again, I don't say that's a super strong set, but when the private companies can go tell the government to mandate something, the government mandates it, and then the private companies collect it, there's this funny public-private partnership going on, and it creates a very skewed scenario where the Constitution can be circumvented, I believe. And so, again, just talking quickly about some potential things to consider, maybe to plant some seeds. But it is one, again, in the comments we welcome. Put ideas down. We'd love to start to talk about it, start to flesh it out, because there is a real need to check the government. To have true liberty, the government can't be watching you all the time. There is an incredible power that comes to anyone that can watch you all the time. And people will seek for that power. And it changes the way you act, changes the way you think. It really destroys liberty. And it's one that we as a society will probably have to choose to put some bounds around at some point. So thanks for joining us as we talk about the Fourth Amendment today and some of the privacy concerns. We really appreciate you and look forward to continuing these discussions as we talk about America, the things that have made it successful, and about how we must balance things by confirming our souls in self-control and our liberty in law. So we will talk again next week. Thanks so much.